We're starting with the worm's perspective, and I know that might sound funny at first because worms don't usually get much attention, but worms understand something very fundamental about life. They understand soil. For a worm, soil is not background. It's not scenery. It's not something you think about later. Soil is everything. A worm understands life entirely through the conditions it lives in. The soil either feeds it or it doesn't. That's the whole equation. If the soil has nutrients, oxygen, moisture, the basic things that support life, the worm stays. If the soil becomes compacted, depleted, toxic, or dead, the worm moves. There's no debate about it. The worm doesn't sit there wondering why the soil changed. It doesn't feel betrayed by it. It doesn't assume it did something wrong. It just notices what's happening. I think this is where humans start to drift away from reality, because when something stops working for us, we tend to turn it into a story. We ask, why is this happening? We ask, what does this mean about me? We ask, what am I supposed to learn from this? The worm doesn't ask any of that. It asks one question over and over again. Is this environment supporting life? That's it. If the answer is no, staying is not an option. Not because the worm is dramatic, not because it's impatient, but because staying means dying. And I don't mean that symbolically, I mean literally. For a worm, staying in bad soil doesn't lead to growth. It leads to suffocation. It leads to depletion. It leads to death. So when worms move, they're not making a statement. They're responding to reality. I think about this a lot in human terms. People will stay in situations that are clearly draining them and say things like, it's just a rough patch, or every job has its downsides, or relationships take work. And yes, sometimes that's true, but sometimes the soil is just bad. Sometimes the conditions have changed in a way that no amount of effort will fix. The worm doesn't argue with that. It doesn't stay loyal to soil that used to be good. It doesn't stay because it remembers when things were better. It doesn't stay because it hopes the soil will become something else. It responds to what's happening now. That's an important distinction, because humans are very good at living in the past or the future. We remember how things used to be, or we imagine how they might become, and we ignore how they actually are. The worm doesn't do that. It lives in the present conditions. If the present conditions support life, it stays. If they don't, it moves. No drama, no self-blame, no heroics, just responsiveness. When worms talk about soil, they're really talking about environments, about systems, about conditions that either allow life to continue or quietly shut it down. And once you see life that way, everything starts to look different. Work becomes soil. Relationships become soil. Communities become soil. Even your internal world can become soil. The worm doesn't judge the soil. It doesn't label it good or bad in a moral sense. It simply recognizes whether life can continue there. That's the framework we're working with in this episode. Everything else we talk about, suffering, relationships, jobs, fear, staying, leaving, all of that is human translation. The worm's message is much simpler than the stories we tell ourselves. If the soil stops feeding you, you move. Not because you're weak, not because you failed, not because you're giving up, but because life wants to continue. That's the worm's world. And from here, we'll keep coming back to it again and again as we look at what this perspective sounds like when you apply it to human life. One of the first things the worm makes clear is this: bad soil is not a personal failure. It doesn't mean the worm did something wrong. It doesn't mean the worm wasn't patient enough. It doesn't mean the worm didn't try hard enough. It just means the conditions aren't right. In nature, bad soil happens all the time. Soil gets compacted, it loses oxygen, it loses nutrients, it gets flooded, it gets contaminated. None of that is interpreted as punishment. It's information. The worm doesn't look around and think, why does this always happen to me? It doesn't think, if I were better, I could survive this. It doesn't think, other worms seem fine. What's wrong with me? The worm doesn't personalize conditions. Humans do. When something stops working in our lives, we almost always turn it inward. We assume we failed. We assume we chose wrong. We assume we didn't see the signs soon enough. We assume we should have known better. People say things like, I should have left earlier, or I should have made it work, or everyone else seems fine. Why can't I handle this? That kind of thinking keeps people stuck in bad soil. Because instead of responding to what's happening now, they start managing shame. The worm doesn't manage shame. It responds to reality. If the environment no longer supports life, staying isn't noble. It's dangerous. And this is important. The worm doesn't wait until the soil is completely dead to move. It responds when conditions begin to change, when oxygen drops, when moisture shifts, when the texture becomes hostile. That sensitivity is not weakness, it's intelligence. For humans, paying attention to early signals often gets dismissed. We tell ourselves we're being dramatic. We tell ourselves we're overreacting. We tell ourselves to be grateful, to toughen up, to stop complaining. But those early signals are information. They're the equivalent of the soil losing oxygen. Ignoring them doesn't make you strong. It makes you late. Bad soil isn't a verdict on your character. It's not proof you failed. It's not evidence that you're broken. It's a signal that something around you is no longer aligned with life. And here's the part people struggle with. You can be good at something and still be in bad soil. You can love someone and still be in bad soil. You can have invested years and still be in bad soil. The worm doesn't argue with that. It doesn't say, but I've already been here so long. It doesn't say, but this used to work. It doesn't say, but leaving means I wasted time. Time isn't wasted if it taught you what no longer feeds you. Bad soil isn't failure. Staying in it indefinitely is what costs you. The worm doesn't judge the soil. It doesn't judge itself. It notices the conditions and responds. That's the difference. And that's the lesson here. Bad soil is not a personal failure. It's a moment of clarity. Worms never romanticize suffering. They don't believe pain is meaningful. They don't believe hardship builds character. They don't believe staying in something harmful makes them stronger, wiser, or more worthy. They don't grow through suffering. They grow through nourishment. That difference matters more than we realize. When a worm encounters harsh conditions, it doesn't say, "This is making me better." It doesn't say, "I'll come out stronger on the other side." It doesn't say, "This must be happening for a reason." It doesn't say anything at all. It responds. Suffering, to a worm, is not a spiritual experience. It's a data point. It means something essential is missing. Humans do the opposite. We turn suffering into a story. We say things like, "This is teaching me patience," or "Everything happens for a reason," or "If I can just endure this, it will all make sense someday." People stay in painful relationships because they believe the suffering means something. They stay in exhausting jobs because they think it's shaping them. They stay in environments that quietly drain them because they don't want the pain to be for nothing. The worm doesn't need suffering to justify itself. It doesn't need pain to have a purpose. I've seen people stay in situations that are clearly hurting them and say things like, "It's just a hard season," or "This is how growth happens," or "Every relationship has ups and downs." And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's just bad soil. And calling it growth doesn't change that. Worms don't confuse intensity with vitality. Just because something feels dramatic doesn't mean it's alive. Just because something is hard doesn't mean it's nourishing. There's a difference between effort and erosion. Humans often miss that. People will say, "But I've learned so much," while they're exhausted, depleted, anxious, and disconnected from themselves. The worm would look at that and say nothing. It would move. Because learning that costs your vitality isn't growth. It's depletion with a story on top. Worms don't stay because they've already suffered. They don't say, "I've already been through so much, I can't leave now." They don't say, "If I leave, all that pain was pointless." They don't stay to redeem the suffering. They don't need to redeem it. Pain doesn't have to be meaningful to be real, and it doesn't have to be redeemed to be left behind. Humans often think leaving means admitting the suffering didn't matter. Worms understand that leaving is how you stop adding more. They don't stay in environments that require constant self-sacrifice just to survive. They don't believe love, loyalty, or commitment should hurt like that. They don't stay because they're afraid that ease means they're avoiding growth. They understand something very simple. Life isn't meant to be survived through constant strain. It's meant to be supported. That doesn't mean life is always easy. It doesn't mean there's no effort. It doesn't mean there's no discomfort. But it does mean that suffering is not the mechanism by which life thrives. Worms don't worship endurance. They don't celebrate how much they can take. They don't build identities around pain. They move toward nourishment, again and again. And that's why worms never romanticize suffering. They don't need it to mean anything. They just need life to continue. Worms never romanticize suffering. They don't believe pain is meaningful. They don't believe hardship builds character. They don't believe staying in something harmful makes them stronger, wiser, or more worthy. They don't grow through suffering. They grow through nourishment. That difference matters more than we realize. When a worm encounters harsh conditions, it doesn't say, "This is making me better." It doesn't say, "I'll come out stronger on the other side." It doesn't say, "This must be happening for a reason." It doesn't say anything at all. It responds. Suffering, to a worm, is not a spiritual experience. It's a data point. It means something essential is missing. Humans do the opposite. We turn suffering into a story. We say things like, "This is teaching me patience," or "Everything happens for a reason," or "If I can just endure this, it will all make sense someday." People stay in painful relationships because they believe the suffering means something. They stay in exhausting jobs because they think it's shaping them. They stay in environments that quietly drain them because they don't want the pain to be for nothing. The worm doesn't need suffering to justify itself. It doesn't need pain to have a purpose. I've seen people stay in situations that are clearly hurting them and say things like, "It's just a hard season," or "This is how growth happens," or "Every relationship has ups and downs." And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's just bad soil. And calling it growth doesn't change that. Worms don't confuse intensity with vitality. Just because something feels dramatic doesn't mean it's alive. Just because something is hard doesn't mean it's nourishing. There's a difference between effort and erosion. Humans often miss that. People will say, "But I've learned so much," while they're exhausted, depleted, anxious, and disconnected from themselves. The worm would look at that and say nothing. It would move. Because learning that costs your vitality isn't growth. It's depletion with a story on top. Worms don't stay because they've already suffered. They don't say, "I've already been through so much, I can't leave now." They don't say, "If I leave, all that pain was pointless." They don't stay to redeem the suffering. They don't need to redeem it. Pain doesn't have to be meaningful to be real, and it doesn't have to be redeemed to be left behind. Humans often think leaving means admitting the suffering didn't matter. Worms understand that leaving is how you stop adding more. They don't stay in environments that require constant self-sacrifice just to survive. They don't believe love, loyalty, or commitment should hurt like that. They don't stay because they're afraid that ease means they're avoiding growth. They understand something very simple. Life isn't meant to be survived through constant strain. It's meant to be supported. That doesn't mean life is always easy. It doesn't mean there's no effort. It doesn't mean there's no discomfort. But it does mean that suffering is not the mechanism by which life thrives. Worms don't worship endurance. They don't celebrate how much they can take. They don't build identities around pain. They move toward nourishment, again and again. And that's why worms never romanticize suffering. They don't need it to mean anything. They just need life to continue. From the worm's perspective, relationships are not abstract. They're not ideas. They're not intentions. They're not promises. They're conditions. They are part of the soil you live in every day. Worms don't separate their body from their environment. What surrounds them is what shapes them. If the soil is nourishing, life continues. If it isn't, life is threatened. When you translate that into human relationships, it becomes very clear very quickly. A relationship that consistently harms you is not neutral. It doesn't matter how much history there is. It doesn't matter how much love there once was. It doesn't matter how much potential you can see. If the environment is harming life, the environment is harming life. Worms don't stay in soil that scrapes them, compresses them, or starves them of oxygen. They don't say, "But this is familiar." They don't say, "But I've already adapted." They don't say, "But sometimes it's good." Humans do. People stay in relationships that hurt them and say things like, "It's not always like this," or "They didn't mean it," or "They're under a lot of stress." People normalize behavior that slowly erodes them because it happens gradually. The worm doesn't normalize erosion. It notices when the environment becomes hostile. And here's the part that matters. Worms don't confuse intensity with connection. Just because something feels strong doesn't mean it's safe. Just because something is passionate doesn't mean it's nourishing. Just because something hurts doesn't mean it's deep. Humans confuse those things all the time. I've seen people describe relationships that leave them anxious, exhausted, and constantly bracing themselves, and then say, "But when it's good, it's really good." The worm doesn't wait for the good moments. It responds to the overall conditions. A relationship that requires you to shrink, explain yourself constantly, walk on eggshells, or override your own signals is bad soil. Not because anyone is evil, not because someone failed, but because life is not being supported there. Worms don't stay to fix the soil from inside it. They don't believe it's their job to make an environment safe that isn't. They don't invite predators into their space hoping things will improve. They don't sacrifice their own survival to maintain a connection. For humans, this gets complicated fast. Fear is real. Attachment is real. Children are real. Money is real. Threats are real. The worm perspective does not ignore any of that. What it does say is this: staying indefinitely in an environment that harms you is not neutral. It has consequences. Movement doesn't always mean leaving right now. It doesn't always mean dramatic action. It doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it means noticing. Sometimes it means naming the truth internally. Sometimes it means preparing quietly. Sometimes it means reaching for support. But staying without orientation toward life is not the same as staying with awareness. Worms don't override their instincts to preserve relationships that are killing them. They move toward what supports life. Not because it's easy, not because it's comfortable, but because survival is not negotiable. That's the worm's perspective on relationships. Worms do not believe that the soil they're in is the only soil that exists. They don't assume that because this is where they are, this is where they're meant to stay. They don't assume that because something is familiar, it's safe. They don't assume that because something once worked, it always will. They know there is more ground. That knowledge changes everything. Scarcity thinking is what convinces humans to stay underground long after the soil has stopped feeding them. It sounds very reasonable when it shows up. It says things like, "This is just how it is right now," or "I should be grateful I have anything at all," or "The job market is terrible," or "Other people have it worse." People say these things not because they're stupid, but because they're afraid. Fear shrinks the world. Scarcity thinking makes the environment feel smaller than it is. It convinces people that the soil they're in is the last patch of ground available, that if they leave, there will be nothing else. Worms don't believe that. They don't need to see every option to know options exist. They don't need proof of abundance before they move. They only need to recognize when staying is no longer viable. Humans, on the other hand, often wait for certainty. They want guarantees. They want a clear plan. They want assurance that the next soil will be perfect before they risk moving. Scarcity thinking keeps them stuck waiting for permission that never comes. I've seen people stay in jobs they hate for years, telling themselves it's temporary while quietly rearranging their lives around misery. They say things like, "Once things settle down," or "after this next quarter," or "when the economy improves." Meanwhile, their energy is draining. Their creativity dries up. Their bodies start to show signs of stress. The worm wouldn't wait that long, because bad soil doesn't announce itself loudly at first. It shows up subtly: a little less oxygen, a little more compression, a little more effort to move. Scarcity thinking tells humans to ignore those early signs. It says, "Don't be dramatic, don't overreact, don't rock the boat." The worm doesn't ignore early signals. It understands that waiting until survival is already compromised makes movement harder, not safer. Scarcity thinking also has a moral edge to it. People are taught that wanting better is selfish, that leaving means you're ungrateful, that staying proves you're responsible. Worms don't moralize survival. They don't believe enduring harm earns virtue. They don't believe scarcity is a character test. They believe life is meant to continue. And here's something important. Scarcity thinking isn't just about money or resources. It shows up emotionally. People stay in relationships that hurt them because they believe connection is rare. They believe love is scarce. They believe they won't find anything else. The worm doesn't believe nourishment is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It trusts the system. It trusts that life doesn't create dead ends on purpose. Scarcity thinking keeps people explaining why they can't move instead of noticing that they need to. It keeps them underground, adapting to worse and worse conditions, calling it resilience. The worm doesn't confuse adaptation with survival. It knows when adaptation has turned into erosion. Abundance, in the worm's sense, is not optimism. It's not positive thinking. It's not pretending everything will work out. It's biological awareness. There is more soil. There is always more soil. Movement is not betrayal. It's not irresponsibility. It's not failure. It's how life responds when conditions change. Scarcity thinking tells people to stay and manage depletion. The worm moves and stays alive. That's the difference. From the worm's perspective, work is not separate from life. It's not a compartment. It's not something you endure so you can live later. It's part of the soil. It's the environment you spend most of your waking hours in. It's the place your energy goes every day. It's the system your body adapts to over time. Worms understand this instinctively. They don't stay in soil that slowly exhausts them just because it once fed them. They don't stay because they've already invested time there. They don't stay because leaving would feel inconvenient. They respond to the conditions that exist now. Humans are much slower to do this. People stay in jobs that drain them and say things like, "It's just a busy season," or "That's just how this industry is," or "At least it pays the bills." And sometimes, yes, work is hard. But there is a difference between effort and erosion. Worms don't confuse the two. A job that requires effort can still nourish you. A job that steadily erodes your health, your confidence, or your sense of self is bad soil. The worm doesn't wait until the soil is completely depleted to move. It doesn't wait until it's exhausted. It doesn't wait until survival is already compromised. It responds early while there is still energy to go somewhere else. Humans often do the opposite. They wait until they're burned out. They wait until they're numb. They wait until their bodies start sending signals they can't ignore. Headaches, anxiety, exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix, a constant sense of dread before the workday starts. Then they say, "I don't know what's wrong with me." The worm would say, "The soil changed." And here's something important. You can be good at your job and still be in bad soil. You can be competent, capable, respected, and still be in an environment that doesn't support life. Worms don't confuse performance with nourishment. Just because you can survive somewhere doesn't mean you should. People also stay because they're afraid of the unknown. They say, "What if the next job is worse? What if I can't find anything else? What if I regret leaving?" The worm understands that staying in known bad soil is not safer than moving. It's just slower harm. There's also a moral layer people put on work. They believe staying proves responsibility, that leaving means giving up, that endurance is a virtue. Worms don't moralize survival. They don't believe suffering earns points. They don't believe loyalty to bad conditions is noble. They believe life is meant to continue. I've seen people reshape their entire lives around jobs that quietly destroy them. They stop doing things they love. They shrink their world. They normalize being tired all the time. They say, "This is just adulthood." The worm doesn't accept that trade. It doesn't sacrifice its future to make the present tolerable. Movement doesn't mean recklessness. It doesn't mean quitting without thought. It doesn't mean chaos. It doesn't mean burning bridges. It means orientation. It means asking, "Is this environment feeding life?" And if the answer keeps being no, it means turning towards something else. Sometimes that turn is small at first. Updating a resume, having a quiet conversation, letting yourself imagine a different life without shutting it down immediately. Those are all forms of movement. Worms don't wait for certainty. They wait for clarity. And clarity comes from paying attention to what's actually happening, not what you wish were happening. Knowing when to move on is not failure. It's discernment. It's responsiveness. It's respecting the fact that life changes and environments change, and survival requires adjustment. The worm doesn't stay where life is being drained. It moves while it still can. That's the worm's perspective on work. When worms move, it doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't look like a big decision. It doesn't look like a declaration. It doesn't look like burning everything down. It looks like orientation. Movement, for a worm, is simply turning toward what supports life. That's important because humans often hear the word move and think it means chaos. They think it means quitting, leaving, disrupting everything all at once. That's not how worms move. Worms move gradually. They move incrementally. They move in response to information. They don't leap out of the ground. They shift direction underground, where it's quiet and unseen. Movement doesn't require certainty. Worms don't need to know exactly where they're going. They don't need guarantees. They don't need proof that the next patch of soil will be perfect. They only need to know that staying where they are is no longer viable. Humans often wait for certainty that never comes. They wait until the fear goes away. They wait until they feel confident. They wait until they have permission. The worm doesn't wait for comfort. It waits for clarity. And clarity comes from paying attention to what's actually happening, not what you wish were happening. Movement can be very small. It can be admitting to yourself that something isn't working. It can be stopping the habit of explaining harm away. It can be letting yourself imagine a different future without immediately shutting it down. Those are all forms of movement. Movement can also be practical. Updating a resume, saving money quietly, talking to someone you trust, gathering information without making an announcement. Worms don't announce their movement. They don't justify it. They don't explain themselves. They don't ask permission. They move because life requires response. Movement is not a one-time event. It's ongoing. Soil changes. Conditions shift. What once fed you may stop feeding you. Worms don't treat movement as a failure of commitment. They treat it as responsiveness. For humans, movement often feels like loss. Loss of identity. Loss of certainty. Loss of what you thought your life would be. The worm doesn't mourn the soil. It doesn't cling to what used to be. It recognizes that clinging is how life gets stuck. Movement is not abandonment. It's not irresponsibility. It's not selfishness. It's orientation toward nourishment. Worms don't wait until they're depleted to move. They don't wait until survival is already compromised. They move while there's still energy to protect. And that's the grounding piece. Movement isn't about being brave or bold or dramatic. It's about being responsive. It's about listening early instead of late. It's about turning toward life again and again, even when the steps are small and quiet. That's what movement really means in the worm's world. And it's how everything we've talked about, work, relationships, scarcity, suffering, actually integrates. Movement is how life continues. The worm does not complicate this. It does not argue. It does not persuade. It does not try to make a case. It responds. When the soil feeds life, the worm stays. When it doesn't, the worm moves. That's the instruction. There is no judgment in it, no moral story, no reward for endurance, no punishment for leaving, just responsiveness to what is actually happening. The worm does not ask why the soil became bad. It does not stay to fix it. It does not wait for it to improve. It doesn't take it personally. It doesn't feel betrayed. It doesn't assume meaning where there is none. It recognizes a change in conditions and adjusts. Humans struggle with this because we want explanations. We want reasons. We want narratives. We want assurance that our pain meant something. The worm doesn't need any of that. It trusts the signal. It trusts that life gives information through conditions. It trusts that responding to that information is not failure. It is intelligence. The instruction is not dramatic. It doesn't tell you to upend your life overnight. It doesn't demand certainty. It doesn't require fearlessness. It asks for honesty. Is this environment feeding life, or is it slowly shutting it down? That question is enough. The worm does not apologize for moving. It does not explain itself. It does not justify its survival. It does not wait to be depleted before responding. It moves while life can still continue. For humans, this instruction can feel unsettling because it removes the story. It doesn't flatter endurance. It doesn't glorify suffering. It doesn't reward staying longer than you should. It asks you to notice the soil. Not once, but again and again. Because conditions change. What fed you once may stop feeding you. What worked before may no longer work now. The worm does not cling to what used to be. It responds to what is. The instruction is simple. Notice the conditions. Listen to the signals. Respond while there is still life to protect. Move toward nourishment. Not once, not dramatically, but repeatedly. That's how life continues. That's the worm's instruction. This has been the Freaksauce Hotline. If this perspective was helpful, you're welcome to listen to another episode or share it with someone who might appreciate it. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you for listening. Goodbye.